The men who survived that winter would later say the creature walked on two legs only when watched, as if it learned their gaze, fed on it, even answered it. But in the beginning, before the hunters understood what stalked them, the forest held its breath in a thick and impossible silence, and the world felt unchanged from the time before men. The story opens with a journal, a leather-bound volume swollen by snowmelt and warped by years of neglect, recovered in the ruins of a forgotten logging camp in the Montana wilderness. Its final page is written in frantic strokes. It stands upright again, not because it must, but because it knows we are here. God help any who follow this trail. It is dated November 14th, 1879. The handwriting ends abruptly. The rest of the page is torn, and so our documentary begins. The year is 1879. The American frontier is still raw scarred by the axes and saws of expanding lumber companies, yet holding vast stretches of land untamed, uncharted, and unmapped by any hand willing to admit what it had seen. Autumn is dying. Winter presses close, pooling in the low places of the Bitterroot Mountains. Daylight arrives pale and thin, like an unwelcome guest. At night, winds sweep through the valleys with a sound that resembles a low moan one that old trappers claim is not wind at all. The forest towers above the intruding men in layered canopies of fir and larch. Fallen needles soften the world underfoot, muffling footsteps until even human movement feels hesitant, borrowed. The air tastes of pine resin and distant snow. Nothing here is casual. Nothing here is gentle. It is a land that remembers. The settlement sits in a clearing about 70 miles from the nearest town, just a cluster of raw cabins, a cookhouse, a supply shed, and a simple bunkhouse known by the workers as Black Hollow. Smoke rises from the chimneys with a wavering uncertainty, as though even the fires question the wisdom of burning in such a place. The men work 13 hours a day felling ponderosa pines, their axes ringing through the cold air like gunshots. At night they drink, mend torn gloves, tell stories of debts back home, and pretend not to hear the strange noises drifting from the deeper forest. But among them 3 figures stand out. 1. Elias Turner, the foreman, a war veteran barely 40, with a stiff shoulder from an old rifle injury. He has the steady gaze of someone who has already seen more than one lifetime's share of violence. Elias is respected, even feared, for the precision with which he runs the camp. Elias came north for one reason, to find a place where the echoes of the war could not reach him. But the silence he finds here is worse. 2. Samuel Reed, the young hunter, only 23, clever, patient, and known for his uncanny ability to track game through the thickest brush. Samuel was hired as the camp's hunter responsible for providing fresh meat and scouting beyond the logging sites. He keeps to himself, writing often in a small journal. Later, his entries will become the backbone of this investigation. 3. Jonah Pike, the old woodsman Jonah, is in his late 50s, though the wilderness has carved deeper years into him. He is trapped across the frontier since before most men at camp were born. When the others laugh at local legends, Jonah does not. When they whistle to chase off unease, Jonah listens. He knows this forest. He knows its rules. And he knows something here does not belong. The first weeks pass without incident. Trees fall, teams haul, snow gathers. The camp's routines settle like sediment. But even in these earliest days, A few details linger strangely in the men's memories, details that none would have questioned at the time. The woods are too quiet. Birdsong cuts off abruptly whenever the loggers approach the valley's edges. The deer that Samuel hunts appear restless, their tracks frequently doubling back, circling trees in odd patterns, as if chased by something they cannot escape. Tools go missing. Not all at once, but subtly. A saw left on a stump disappears between shifts. A lantern set beside a felled tree vanishes before dusk. At first, the men blame each other, accusing newcomers of theft. But the truth is simpler, more unsettling. No thief leaves prints leading in, but none leading out. Even the snow seems to fall strangely, drifting thicker around the perimeter of the camp than within it, as though the forest deliberately hides its own boundaries. Jonah is the first to speak aloud what others feel, only in uneasy glances. This valley watches us. The men laugh, but not wholeheartedly. It is during the third week that Samuel Reed begins to sense something deeper. While tracking a wounded mule deer west of camp, he notices impressions in the mud, not quite prints, not quite claw marks, something in between. They look almost like knuckles, as if something crawled on all fours, something heavy. He follows them for nearly a mile until they vanish abruptly at the base of a slope, as though the creature lifted itself off the ground entirely. Samuel later writes, "Whatever made those marks moved with intention, not instinct. I felt watched the entire time, as if my own tracks were being studied in return." When he returns to Black Hollow at dusk, Samuel finds the men gathered around the fire, whispering about a shape sighted between the trees, tall, thin, nearly still. Only for a second, only before it sank into the undergrowth and vanished. No one speaks with confidence. No one admits fear aloud. But the forest has begun its work. Foreman Elias Turner does not tolerate superstition in his camp. He gathers the men one morning, frost clinging to his beard, and orders them to stay focused. "This forest is no different from any other," he states firmly. "It makes sounds, casts shadows, and plays tricks on tired men. Keep working. Keep your heads." But even Elias begins to sense something, a quiet that settles over the valley at odd hours, too sudden, too complete. The crack of a falling tree echoes unnaturally far, as if swallowed by a great hollow chamber beneath the earth. He starts waking at night, unsure why. The second the wind changes, he feels a coldness crawl across the bunkhouse timbers, as though some presence outside is tracing its fingers along the walls. And every night, Jonah Pike sits awake by the embers of the cookhouse fire, watching, listening, as if he expects something. There is one moment and insignificant detail at the time that every survivor later recalls with perfect clarity. Late October, the sky heavy with snow that has not yet fallen. Samuel, returning from a short hunt, pauses at the tree line before entering camp. For a single breath, he is certain he sees eyes between the branches, not glowing, not animal-like, just watching, unblinking, level with his own, and then gone. He tells no one. He cannot explain why. That night brings an early freeze, the cold so absolute that the bunkhouse timber groans under its own contraction. The men huddle near the stove, half asleep, while the wind carries through the cracks a faint rhythmic tapping, almost like footsteps circling the building. Jonah Pike does not sleep at all. He sits upright on his bunk, every muscle taut. He whispers a single warning into the dark. It knows we're here now. 3 days before the first true incident, the camp awakes to a disturbing discovery. Near the woodpile in perfect snow lie human footprints, bare, deep, leading straight toward the cabins. But they stop abruptly just 10 paces from the door ending in a final impression where the heel suddenly sinks deeper, as though the figure shifted its weight, and rose onto 2 legs, balancing unnaturally before stepping backward into the forest on all 4s, leaving distorted drag marks behind. Elias orders everyone to stay calm. Samuel studies the prints with a hunter's precision. Jonah says nothing, though his face turns ashen. Later he tells Samuel privately, "A man leaves a left print, then a right. This thing, it leaves them wrong. Like it don't understand how feet should fall. This will not be the last sign, nor the most disturbing. But it is the first undeniable proof that something has begun to observe them, something that is learning, mimicking, adjusting, waiting." The journal entries that survive from Black Hollow do not leap straight into spectacle. They tend instead toward small things, omissions, oddities, a tone that grows thinner, like paper left too long in a damp attic. The terror there is patient. It begins by rearranging the ordinary. Not a roar, not the clear snap of a rifle. Something subtle, a soft, repetitive knock that comes at odd intervals, as if fingers were testing the same tree at different hours. Sometimes it imitates the rhythmic tapping of an axe. Other times it matches the tempo of a man walking. At first the loggers shrug. Wood is a living thing. Frost cracks, branches fall. But the knocking comes closer to the camp, from the tree line where no trail leads. Night amplifies everything. When the men turn in, the forest arranges its own hushbird calls, cut short. Insects that should be persistent fall silent. From within that silence a new sound swells, a low, rolling exhalation that might be wind or might be something breathing. Samuel, who learned to read sound like a page, begins waking to it as if to a clock. The noise had a timing, he writes later. It would start slow, like someone trying to learn a tune. Then it would build, quick, certain, and stop when I moved. It was like being listened to from a distance. Footprints tell half-truths. At dawn, Samuel finds impressions in the snow that refuse simple explanation. Sometimes the prints are unmistakably human heel, ball, toe pressed deep in the new powder. But between them there are other marks, long dragging gouges, as if hands had skidded along the earth. The spacing is wrong. The stride alternates unevenly, then returns to a careful, measured step. Where the print trail meets the trees, it dissolves into nothing. More disturbing are the prints that appear around the camp pairs of bare footprints, stepping deliberately up to a bunkhouse door and stopping, as if the thing had paused to consider entering. No one at Black Hollow ever reports missing clothing or obvious theft. Tools are misplaced but not taken. It is as if whoever passed by did so to study, not to take. Jonah Pike pins a scrap of leather to his chest, where the prints end at the woodpile. He later describes how the impressions compress the snow, like something heavy testing how a man settles into a space. He calls them poses, an odd word that unsettles the younger men. The idea is simple and strange. This thing tries on the shape of a man, then drops it and retreats. The thefts are small, a lantern missing for a day, a hatchet mislaid on a stump. Each loss is the sort of inconvenience men shrug off. It's only the pattern that makes their tempers thin. Accusations begin under breath. Newer hands are suspected. A veteran claims later. Yet the items are found in strange places. A saw leaning against a log half a mile from the fall site. A wedge buried under a thin cover of needles with no trail leading to it. The men begin to police their work more closely. They leave no loose item outside overnight. They place lanterns inside the bunks. When Elias orders anyone caught tampering with tools to be sent off with no pay, it is less an exercise of discipline than an attempt to keep morale from unraveling. Still, the losses continue in a manner that seems intentional and almost performative, an invisible hand arranging props on a stage to study how actors react. When the camp grows uneasy enough to seek counsel, Jonah rides the nearest ridgeline and calls on an old trapper named Amos Whitlock, who trades pelts for mail and gossip with the settlements beyond. Amos is a loose repository of the frontier's whispers, names, warnings, things half remembered. What he tells them is a map of overlapping stories. There's talk round these parts of what the Indians call the mirror walker, Amos says, lowering his voice. Not one name, every band calls it something else. They warn children, don't meet its eyes. Don't let it learn your step. It waits in the thick so it can practice being you. Jonah listens with a steady face. Elias bristles. Samuel is curious and unnerved in equal measure. Later, Elias will insist the trapper is spinning yarns to secure trade. But he cannot hide how the old man's words latch to the men like burrs. For Jonah, who remembers language older than the newcomers, the account is not wholly myth. He recalls his father's stories of a presence that tries suits on the dead and a trickster that mimics gestures. In Jonah's telling, the line between spirit and animal is not clear. The creature belongs to a continuity of forest things that adapt, learn, and sometimes change the rules for humans. Those who keep records at Black Hollow obsess over print and ink like a prayer. Samuel collects scraps in old prospector's log found in a rusted tin, a faded photograph of a road crew from decades earlier. In the margins of one brittle diary, a prospector has scrawled a warning in a rush. Do not look. It takes a thing's walk. Photographs, too, prove treacherous. A daguerreotype found rolled into a cylinder in the supply chest shows 3 men standing beneath a tree. In the background there is a smudge, only a blur when first seen, but the men at camp later swear there is the suggestion of another figure standing too straight, not quite a man in stance, at the tree's edge. They argue into the night about whether it is merely a flaw in the plate. The photograph becomes a small myth for them, a thing to point at, when they need reason to blame something other than hunger or fatigue. Some more cautious voices recommend leaving. Others remind that the contract for the timber runs until spring. Money for those men is the steady force that wills them to continue. The forest, however, offers no invoices and takes no heed. Small omens begin to aggregate and press on the psychology of the camp. Animals avoiding trails, a dog that will no longer enter the tree line, a lantern that sputters with a cold wind inside a closed room. Men begin to dream the same dream of standing alone and feeling observed, of dressing in a stranger's clothes and not remembering when they put them on. Elias walks these nights with his rifle. He tells the men to watch their shadows. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes the shadow in the flame stretches and lingers longer than the man who casts it. And in that extra stretch, a new fear is born, the suspicion that something is not merely hiding from them, but practicing how to be them. On a gray November morning, Samuel discovers a crude stack of bark outside the cookhouse. Arranged on it are 3 small objects: a carved bone button, a length of twine, and a circle of moss. They are placed with a symmetry that suggests deliberation. The men call it a message. Jonah calls it an offering. He fingers the button, and his knuckles whiten. He says nothing, but later, long after the men have grown too afraid to speak, he will tell how he felt. That morning, as though a room full of unseen spectators had paused to watch him move. He writes in the journal, "It is not a thing that wants to eat us first. It wants to learn us. It wants to be known." The line is short, clean, and terrifying. By early November, the sky hangs low over Black Hollow, swollen with snow that refuses to fall. A strange metallic smell clings to the air like cold iron and wet stone. Jonah Pike mutters that storms held back too long were unnatural, a word Elias dismisses but cannot entirely ignore. The bunkhouse creaks in the wind. The men lie in their blankets, but no one truly sleeps. The nights have lengthened, and in them the strange, rhythmic knock, knock, knock from the trees has grown bolder. Samuel Reed is awake long before the others. A hunter's instincts rarely sleep. He feels something walking the ridge beyond the camp. Not heavy, not fast, but knowing. It moves like a man too tall for its own comfort. When he rises to look from the bunkhouse window, the forest beyond is still too still, like a portrait painted with no breath in it. But something is missing. The birds have not called for 3 days. The first true warning comes before dawn. A scream slices the valley high, desperate and abrupt. Not a human scream. No man would mistake it. It is the sound of a mule deer dying violently and too quickly. Samuel is out the door with his rifle before his boots are tied. Other men stumble out behind him into the bluish pre-dawn cold. The sound came from the tree line, no more than 200 yards away, but the forest is silent again, as if it swallowed the violence whole. Jonah examines the ground near the edge of camp. Snow is disturbed in odd patterns, drag marks that begin sharply, then fade. No blood, no hoof prints, no tracks of any predator. "It was carried," Jonah murmurs, "lifted clean." Elias shakes his head. "By what? A bear? A cat?" Jonah looks at the tree line for a long, unblinking moment. Bears don't walk quiet as breath. The men return to camp unsettled. Breakfast goes untouched. Samuel notices something else. The scream ended too fast. Predators wound before they kill. Whatever took that deer? Silenced at mid-cry. At midday, while the loggers drag a fresh haul toward the saw pit, Elias sends Samuel to fetch more firewood. The wood pile sits just beyond the cabins, close to where the strange footprints appeared days earlier. When Samuel rounds the corner, he freezes. A shape stands beside the wood pile, motionless, half concealed by a leaning fir. Tall, too tall. Shoulders slightly hunched, as if adjusting itself. For a moment, Samuel's mind insists it is a man. A very large man. But the posture is wrong. The arms hang too long, the torso too narrow, the angle of the neck slightly, curious, tilted, like someone mimicking human stance and not quite getting it right. Samuel lifts his rifle. The shape does not move. Then slowly it lowers itself onto all fours with a fluid, unnatural ease. The limbs fold not like a bear's, but like a person kneeling with dislocated joints. It slips behind the woodpile and disappears soundlessly, as if swallowed by the earth. Samuel approaches, breath sharp in his throat. The space behind the pile is empty. No broken branches, only the faintest imprint in the snow where something heavy settled briefly. He hurries back to Elias. "You saw a shadow," Elias insists. "A trick of the light," but Samuel's expression tells him otherwise. Jonah listens quietly to the account and says only one thing: it stood to be seen. It knelt to leave. That evening, a man named David Corcoran, one of the newer loggers, fails to return after checking the eastern trapline. He is steady-handed, sober, and known for punctuality. When the sun sinks behind the mountain, Elias orders 2 men to take lanterns and search. They return pale and shaken. They found the trapline. They found David's tracks. And then they found where he ran. The prints shift from a normal walking stride to frantic, wide-spaced leaps. Branches are broken at strange angles higher than a man could reach. The snow shows indentations where something large moved parallel to him, silent and unhurried. At the base of a spruce, David's rifle lies snapped clean in half. But no blood, no body, no drag marks. Only a set of impressions circling the tree, impressions that alternate between hands and feet, as though something had crawled around it, watching him. Before rising again, Elias orders the men back to camp. They do not sleep that night. Shortly before midnight, as wind pushes the bunkhouse walls inward like a beating heart, Thomas Hargreave, a sawyer known for rarely speaking, bolts upright from his bunk. He hears something tapping on the outer wall, not knocking, listening. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. He inches toward the window. The frost on the glass obscures his view, but the moon paints long shadows across the clearing, and there between the bunkhouse and the supply shed moves a figure, walking, slow, measured, on 2 legs. Its gait is almost human, but not quite, each step too deliberate, each foot placed as though copying something seen but not understood. Its arms swing with an attempt at imitation, but the rhythm is off, artificial. Thomas' breath fogs the window. The figure stops. It turns its head toward him with a smooth, unnatural precision, no hesitation, as though its senses extend farther than sight or sound. For a heartbeat, neither moves. The figure's posture shifts. Its spine straightens, vertebrae clicking faintly in the cold air. It rises another inch, adjusting height as if correcting itself based on his gaze. And then, slowly, fluidly, it drops to all fours. But the transition is wrong. The limbs fold inward, elbows bending backward, knees twisting lightly, as though joints do not constrain it. It crawls toward the tree line, not fast, not afraid, simply leaving. But before it melts into the trees, it pauses and turns its head again tilted, curious, as though gauging Thomas's reaction. Then it vanishes. Thomas collapses to the floor. His scream wakes the entire bunkhouse. Elias hurries to the door, rifle ready. Jonah stands at the window, narrow-eyed. "What did you see?" Elias demands. Thomas is shaking so violently he can barely form words. "It walks like us when we're looking." The men fall silent. Jonah whispers, "Mirror walker." But Samuel interrupts. He has been staring out the western window. "There," he says quietly. Across the clearing, just beyond lantern light, something stands between 2 trees. Not moving, perfectly still. The men gather at the window, breath fogging the glass. The figure is tall, nearly 7 feet, and impossibly thin. Its arms are long enough that the fingertips graze its knees. Elias lifts his rifle, but the moment the barrel rises, the creature rises too. Its posture shifts, imitating him. Not threatening, mirroring, the men freeze. Slowly, Elias lowers the gun. Slowly, the creature lowers itself into a crouch. A ripple of horror crawls through the bunkhouse as the truth settles in. It isn't following them. It is learning them. Jonah whispers, "Do not move. Do not show it anything new." For a long moment, nothing happens. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees behind the creature, a second shape moves. Not stepping, sliding. The first creature turns its head not toward the men, but toward whatever else is approaching. The two shapes regard each other briefly, silently. Then both melt backward into the tree line, disappearing without sound, as though the forest swallows them whole. A cold wind sweeps across the clearing, extinguishing one of the lanterns. The bunkhouse door trembles, and the men realize they are no longer dealing with one creature. The valley holds more. Elias Turner took charge with the rigid calm of a man who knew order could stave off panic. He divided the camp into watches, posted sentries at the tree line, and made rules that read like small prayers. No one leaves alone after dusk. Lanterns are never extinguished outdoors, and every man must sleep with clothing and a coil of rope at reach. They built a simple palisade from felled saplings around the most vulnerable side of the camp thin, crude and insufficient by any standard, but the act of building did more than provide wood. It gave them purpose. Hammers rang through the hollow with a sharper timbre now, the rhythm of human hands against timber trying to drown out the forest's strange music. Jonah patterned his watch from older instincts. He insisted on leaving small offerings at the periphery, bundles of flint, old tobacco, a scrap of cloth tied to a branch. If something's half thing, half spirit, you don't just scare it, he told them. You show it, you notice it. You mark the line where man ends and forest begins. Samuel mapped the trails, drawing crude lines in the snow and learning the places where the animals went quiet. He measured the footprint intervals, cataloged the drag marks, and began to notice the patterns. The creature mimicked posture first, then gait, then the subtler things. How a man adjusted his shoulders when carrying a log, the half-turn when entering a doorway. It practiced in the dark, perfecting the small human errors, and every night it watched for the new. Elias organized a daylight reconnaissance. They would not go in blind. Instead, 4 men, Elias, Jonah, Samuel, and Thomas, would walk the ridge where the first tracks had been found. The intention was practical. Locate dens, signs of a lair, anything to explain the uncanny movement. They left with muskets, hatchets, a coil of rope, and, at Samuel's insistence, a simple iron trap left from an old prospector. Samuel bound small tin bells to branches near likely paths, reasoning that while the creatures might be silent, sound would reveal movement. The forest greeted them with an indifferent wind. It was a hunting place that did not offer itself. Their boots sank into a crust of frost. The men spread out in a careful wedge, eyes trained on the floor of the woods. Every twig creak produced a small public flinch. At first the trail gave nothing. Then, near a shallow ravine, Samuel paused. He crouched and traced a print with a gloved finger. The curious thing about these impressions was how tentative the toes looked rounded, as if something had practiced pressing a boot to snow, but had used padding instead. Between each step in the soft soil were faint smears almost like fingerprints. "I've seen this before," Jonah murmured. "An animal will leave the same sort of smudge if it's rubbing against bark, but these look like tests, like it's feeling the ground to learn it." Elias stood, scowling. "It's learning to walk like us," he said flatly. "We catch it at that. We stop it there. They found more traps laid not their own. A circle of rocks with bark laid over them, a crude shelter of branches, and a row of small woven cords tied between saplings. Deliberate, careful, almost domestic. Whoever had made these was not a creature acting by blind instinct. They were thoughtful, deliberate, methodical. Samuel's bells remained silent. That night they posted lanterns in a ring and left a false trail logs dragged outward in a deliberate pattern of boot placed on a stump where a footprint could be copied, a patch of blood-smeared fur tied to a cedar branch to suggest a wounded animal. It was a trap of appearance rather than violence, a stage theater to see whether the watcher would perform. At 2 a.m, Jonah heard the softest scraping, like the brushing of hands across bark. He nudged Thomas, who lay awake with eyes like lantern coals. They watched from the loft as a shadow detached from the tree line and moved toward the ring. The thing did not rush. It approached with the same studied patience they had seen before, checking the stage signs as a scholar might inspect a paper. It paused at the false blood, lowered its head, then straightened again. It crouched, shifted onto 2 legs, mimicked the position of a man peering over a stump, and then resumed all 4s. It tested the boot on the stump. It turned its head as though marking the men who watched, and then, after an eternity that lasted only seconds, moved away. Jonah did not fire. Elias withheld. They learned from that silence that the creature's attention was delicate, bruised by violence, perhaps, or subject to something like curiosity. Bullets might provoke it to hide. A shot might teach it to mimic louder noises. They had taken the first step. They had baited the watcher and watched it in return. Over the next week, the pattern became clearer and more frightening. The creature did not merely imitate posture. It imitated behavior. It learned the camp's schedules. It would appear just after the men had cleared the sawdust, as if studying the clean floor, then vanish when the men returned. When Elias trained a hound to patrol the perimeter, the creature began leaving sets of prints that deliberately avoided the dog's route. At one point, Samuel rigged a crude alarm strips of tin, wired to a coil that would ring if trampled. In the morning, the tin lay quiet. The wire had been cut cleanly, and the tin lay arranged in a new pattern across the trail. 2 strips crossed in an X. Someone had visited their alarm and left a message. Jonah studied the X and muttered, "It's marking out meaning. It's making signs." What meaning? To warn, to claim, to communicate? They could only guess. The idea that they were being regarded as objects of study moved from superstition to a systemic fear. The men felt observed not in the sense of being hunted, but catalogued, and with cataloging comes change. The creatures adapted faster than any one man might predict. They began mimicking mannerisms that were not purely physical, the way Elias barked orders, the way Thomas clicked his tongue at a saw. Samuel observed one morning that a line of prints paused at the latrine and then moved away, as if the watcher had been curious about privacy. A human mind under such sustained observation bends, quiet suspicions hardened into accusations. Men found themselves chastised for looking at one another, afraid their gestures might be copied and used against them. The collective unity that had kept the camp together started to splinter under the strain of hypersensitivity. Elias grew harsher. He barked orders with less patience. He demanded the men file every stray tool into a ledger. He warned them in tones that suggested not just danger, but the possibility of infection. A man's gait, once taught wrong, could be taken and turned into a lure. Thomas, once quiet and steady, became jumpy, flinching at shadows, losing his appetite. He started sleeping with his rifle across his knees. David's absence, still unexplained, hung over every decision like a half-finished hymn. A small mutiny occurred when 3 younger men wanted to light a pyre at the tree line and drive the creatures with fire. Elias forbade it. The men muttered about cowardice. Jonah intervened, telling them stories of spirits driven into rages by flames. The young men sulked. Some looked guilty. That night, a bell rang in the outer field, Samuel's alarm, several nights after he had repaired it. They rushed out in a clamor of breath and lantern light. The bell hung, intact. The wire had not been disturbed, but near the base of a stunted pine, someone had set a crude mannequin, an arrangement of bark, twine, and old fabric, posed in a walking stance. Around its neck was tied a small scrap of paper torn from Samuel's journal. On it, in the crude scratches of a twig, were the faint marks of a copied line. One word, repeated over and over until the ink fuzzed through the paper. They could not read it. They could not make sense of it. But when Jonah bent low, he whispered. A note like prayer and dread joined. It watches. It writes, that same night, beneath a pale moon, a sound rose from the tree line unlike any they had heard before, a sequence of precise, intentional taps, 3 in quick succession, a silence, then 2 slow knocks like a language framed in wood. All at once the bells around the camp rang, every one of them, though none had been touched. From the ridge above, a shadow stepped forward. Not one of the creatures they'd seen, but a silhouette moved with an arrogance that felt like intent. It paused and raised its head, as if addressing the camp by sight alone. Elias raised his rifle. The figure tilted its head, matching his motion exactly, and a thin, imitative voice too high and too clear to be a man's issued from the trees in a mockery of speech. It said in a tone that was not a voice yet was unmistakably language. We learn. The men froze. Outside, beyond the palisade, the forest answered with a long, low rustle that sounded suspiciously like laughter. In any frontier tale, there comes a moment when fear ceases to be atmosphere and becomes force, a thing that reaches out, takes hold, and reshapes the world around it. For Black Hollow, that moment arrived 3 nights after the creatures first spoke. But the men would later say the attack didn't begin that night. It began the moment the forest learned their names. The mood in camp had soured into something dense and unspoken. Lanterns hung along the palisade flickered in the wind, each flame stretching thin as if trying to flee its own wick. Frost gathered along the fence rails. Even the horses had become restless, stamping the earth and blowing steam from their nostrils in uneasy fits. Elias ordered every man inside the bunkhouse, except Jonah, Samuel, and Thomas, the 3 who knew the creature's patterns best. The 4 men sat with rifles across their laps, boots laced tight, breath shallow. Every nerve in the room hummed like a drawn bowstring. Then, as the moon rose, the knocking began. not the gentle, tentative taps of earlier nights. These were deliberate, intentional, calling. Knock, knock. Pause. Knock. The exact pattern Samuel had used to call the men back from the work line. "It's repeating our signals," Samuel whispered. Thomas swallowed. "Why? To draw us out?" Jonah's face tightened. "No, to show it can." The knocking stopped abruptly. The men held their breath. Then nothing. Not silence, but the absence of everything. No wind. No wind. No wolves. No insect chirr. The world held completely still. Elias's hand tightened around his rifle so hard the wood creaked. And then, from behind the bunkhouse, came the sound of something enormous shifting its weight, the groan of timber under strain. A shadow passed across the frosted window. Thomas bolted upright, breath shaking. That's too big. That's not the thing we saw." "No," Jonah said. "It's more than one." The lantern flame sputtered violently, and then the wall behind them scraped. A long drag of something sharp across the planks, slow, exploratory, almost tender, as if tracing the outline of the men inside. Elias whispered, "Hold. Do not shoot unless it breaks through." The scraping stopped. Then, a single finger tapped the wall exactly where Thomas was standing. Tap, tap, tap. Thomas stumbled backward in terror. The tap followed. Tap, tap, tap. Samuel exhaled shakily. "It knows where we are," Jonah corrected him softly. "It knows who we are." A sharp crack split the night, wood splitting. Not near the bunkhouse, at the palisade. The horses screamed and tore at their tethers. Elias shouted, "Outside, move!" The men burst from the bunkhouse, lanterns swaying violently. The cold slapped them raw. Their breath fogged instantly as they sprinted toward the far end of the enclosure. What they found froze them in place. A section of the palisade, logs as thick as a man's torso, had been pulled outward, not pushed in, dragged open like driftwood on a beach. Something had entered the camp. "Positions," Elias barked. But even as he spoke, the lantern light flickered, not from wind, from movement above them. Samuel looked up. A shape clung to the rafters of the supply shed roof. Long limbs bent at grotesque angles, hands gripping the wood with impossible strength. Its face hidden in shadow except for the faintest hint of pale skin, wrong in shape, as if the bones beneath had rearranged themselves imperfectly. It watched them upside down. Then it crawled sideways across the wall, vanishing into the dark with horrifying speed. Thomas screamed and fired into the night. The blast echoed like thunder. "Hold your fire," Elias roared. "They want us to panic." But it was too late, the forest answered. A chorus of knocking erupted, dozens of points at once, from the trees, from the roof, from beneath the soil. The sounds came in overlapping patterns, mimicries of the men's shouts, their hammer strikes, their marching calls. The creatures were repeating their lives back at them, mocking them, learning them, preparing. The woodpile collapsed suddenly. A massive shape burst from behind it, a blur of motion, too fast, too smooth, more like a shadow than a body. Jonah fired, once, twice, but the bullets seemed to skim through something that wasn't fully solid. The lanterns guttered. Another figure darted between cabins, its limbs hitting the ground with the rhythm of a man trying to remember how to run. Thomas backed away, trembling violently. "It's copying me. Oh God, it's copying me." because one of the creatures had matched his stance exactly. Knees bent, rifle raised, shoulders trembling. It moved when he moved. A grotesque mirror. Elias grabbed him. "Don't look at it. Don't give it more to learn." But Thomas couldn't break away, and the creature leaned closer, as if studying his face. A scream tore through the clearing, high, sharp, horribly human. Not Thomas, the missing hunter, David Corcoran. His voice perfectly mimicked. The men froze because the scream came from the tree line. Jonah shook his head violently. "That's not him. That's not him," Samuel whispered. "It's luring us out." But another voice followed. Thomas's voice, crying for help, sobbing, pleading, from deep in the woods. The real Thomas, trembling beside them, whispered, That ain't me." He dropped to his knees. The imitation continued, louder, closer. Jonah grabbed Elias's arm with desperate force. "If we go out there, we're dead. We stay," Elias said. "We hold here." But the creatures no longer needed them to leave the camp. They came to the camp. 3 lanterns blew out simultaneously. A 4th was crushed underfoot by something unseen. Darkness washed over the camp in waves. Only 2 lanterns remained, Elias's and Samuel's. Their light barely reached 10 feet. In that narrow glow, the men saw shapes circling them, crawling, rising, tilting their heads in sickening imitation of human curiosity. One stepped into the light. Its silhouette jittered, as if unsure which posture to maintain. It tried standing. It tried crouching. It tried becoming something between the two. Its chest rose and fell in exaggerated breaths, copying panic. Then it screamed. A perfect copy of Samuel's voice. Samuel staggered backward, lantern shaking. That's I never. Elias shoved Samuel aside just as the creature collided with the cabin wall, splintering wood. The lantern shook violently but stayed lit. The creature recoiled, retreating into shadow with unnatural speed, limbs folding in ways the men could not comprehend. Jonah ran to Samuel. "You're bleeding." Samuel touched his cheek. A thin line of blood ran where the creature's claws or fingers had grazed him. Not a deep cut, but a mark, a claim. Jonah whispered, "It knows you now." From the trees came a low, coordinated knocking in a new pattern. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock. Elias murmured, "What in God's name is that supposed to be?" Jonah's face drained of color. They're answering each other, calling positions, coordinating. The knocking intensified. Dozens of creatures now, circling, signaling, tightening the perimeter. The men were being surrounded like cattle in a pen. The forest had become a mouth, the camp a throat, and the creatures were closing in. The creature struck suddenly, as if deciding the learning phase was complete. A dark blur shot from beneath the bunkhouse, grabbing Thomas by the legs. He screamed, a real, raw scream, as he was dragged toward the tree line. Elias and Samuel lunged for him. Their hands closed around his coat, but the creature was impossibly strong. In one violent jerk, Thomas was torn from their grip. His scream echoed once, then stopped, abruptly, as if cut off mid-breath. The force gave nothing back, no body, no blood, only silence. Jonah fell to his knees. Samuel stared into the trees with hollow eyes. Elias whispered, voice breaking, "They're not hunting us." He slowly raised his lantern. "They're taking us." One by one, the remaining lantern flickered. The knocking resumed, closer now. more confident, more human. The creatures stop observing. They begin acting, and the camp suffers its first true loss. When you re-ready for the story's darkest turn, the climax and unresolved fate, say, there are nights on the frontier when the world no longer resembles itself, nights that rewrite a man as understanding of the wilderness and his place inside it. For the few survivors of Black Hollow, the night after Thomas vanished became such a dividing line. After that moment, there were only two ways of remembering: the time before the forest woke fully, and the time after. The men returned to the bunkhouse like wounded animals. No one spoke. The walls groaned as if burdened by the weight of what had just occurred. Lantern lights shook on the ceiling beams, trembling not from wind, but from the unsteady hands that held them. Samuel sat rigid on his bunk, hand pressed to his cheek where the creature had touched him. The cut had stopped bleeding, but the skin felt warm, wrong, as if the thing's touch lingered beneath the flesh. Jonah sat beside him, shoulders heavy. Elias barred the door, then moved to each window, checking the shutters 3 times. Survival had narrowed his world into compulsions. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady rasp. "We cannot stay here." No one argued. Outside, the creatures had stopped knocking, stopped moving, stopped showing themselves, and somehow that was worse. The silence pressed inward like a tightening fist. Elias gathered the remaining men, 8 now, and spread a rough map across the table. The nearest outpost was 18 miles south, reachable only by a narrow trail that cut through a ravine thick with old-growth pine. "We travel at dawn," Elias said. "We move fast. We do not stop for anything. Not voices, not sounds, not footprints. They will try to lure us apart." Jonah shook his head. "They'll know we're leaving. They've learned our preparations. They've learned our patterns. We need misdirection." Samuel looked up. "Fire," he said quietly. "They avoid open flame. We burn the north ridge. Draw them there. Then we slip south." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Elias nodded slowly. A diversion. It could work, but Jonah's expression dimmed. "Fire draws spirits as well as beasts," he murmured. "But tonight, it may be the only thing that listens." Hours before dawn, Samuel stepped outside to gather kindling for the diversion fire. A faint glow flickered between the trees. He froze. Something in the forest was already shining, not flame, but the imitation of flame. A trembling amber pulse, rising and falling irregularly, as if something was watching their preparations and copying the light. Samuel backed slowly toward the bunkhouse. But before he could speak, the glow winked out instantly, snuffed like a breath blown across a candle. Elias understood at once. "They know," he whispered. "The forest knows." Before departing, Jonah insisted the men eat. "You don't meet the unknown on an empty stomach," he said. "You meet it with strength." They heated beans, boiled black coffee, tore bread into uneven pieces. The meal felt ceremonial, like an old ritual held at the mouth of a grave. None of them knew who would live to tell what happened next. Samuel forced himself to eat, though every bite felt like a stone. The strange warmth in his cheek had spread to his jaw like a fever. Jonah's eyes lingered on him. "If it marked you," Jonah said quietly, "it may follow you first." Samuel didn't answer. The warmth pulsed, almost like a heartbeat. As morning approached, a blue, icy fog settled across the camp, unusually dense, swallowing lantern beams in damp halos. Elias cursed under his breath. "They're masking the trees," Jonah murmured. "They want us blind." The men shouldered packs, gripped rifles, and lingered for one final heartbeat outside the bunkhouse. Then Elias whispered, "Go." They slipped south through the clearing, boots crunching over frost. The fog thickened behind them, sealing the camp from view like a curtain closing on a stage. No one looked back. By midday they reached the ravine, a long gorge where old pines leaned together, overhead, blotting out the sun. The place felt ancient, older than any map, older than the men who dared walk through it. Even the horses refused to enter. The men continued on foot. Jonah paused at the entrance, touched a pine trunk, and whispered something the others didn't understand. Elias asked, "A blessing?" "A warning," Jonah replied. "To the forest, not to us." They pressed deeper. Every sound echoed strangely. Branches creaked in slow, mournful tones. Snow fell in tiny spirals, though the sky above was clear. And then, knock, a single tap on wood. But not ahead. Behind, the men spun, rifles raised. Nothing. Then another knock, to their left, then to their right. Then above. The creatures were circling them from every direction, using the walls of the ravine to bounce sound like a hunting call. Elias shouted, "Keep moving," but Samuel had stopped. A voice echoed down the ravine, his own voice. "Samuel, help me." The same tone he had used when the creature screamed in his imitation days earlier. Then another voice layered atop it, deeper. Thomas's voice. "Samuel, don't leave me." Samuel staggered backward, rifle slipping from numb fingers. Jonah grabbed him. "Don't listen. Don't look toward the voices." But the voices shifted again. This time Elias's voice, from the tree line. Calling his own name back at him, Elias froze. The forest had learned their identities. One by one, the men began hearing themselves echoing through the trees, pleading, shouting, crying, whispering. A chorus of their own voices surrounded them, none of it human, none of it real, and all of it incredibly close. Snow exploded beside Samuel. Something had landed there, something that didn't fully disturb the ground, as if only parts of it bore weight. It crawled up the ravine wall in a blur, limbs shifting between two-legged and four-legged gait, body twisting with sickening elasticity. Another shape dropped behind Elias, tall, thin, posture tilting like a half-completed imitation of a man. Elias fired. The blast echoed. The creature recoiled, not from pain, but from surprise, as though reminded that humans could react. Then it opened its mouth and screamed in Elias's voice, "Move!" The forest erupted. Figures darted along the ridges, silhouettes elongated by the warped daylight. Some crawled along the underside of fallen logs. Others walked perfectly upright, arms swinging in clumsy imitation. The men ran. One man, Jacob Price, slipped on ice. A creature matched the fall exactly, mirroring his posture as it descended upon him. He screamed once, then was yanked upward into the branches. Snow drifted down where he had been. Another man broke formation, running blindly toward a side path. A creature followed in perfect synchrony, its footsteps landing a fraction of a second after his. Then he disappeared around a bend. His scream echoed back, cut short. Elias grabbed Samuel by the coat. "Stay with me." "I'm here," Samuel choked. But the warmth in his cheek suddenly pulsed hard. like a second heartbeat syncing with something outside his body. He staggered. He heard whispering his own voice inside his skull. Jonah saw him reel. "It marked you. It's calling to you." "I'm fine," Samuel insisted. But he wasn't. Something unseen brushed his shoulder, softly, like a hand guiding him. The final separation. The men reached the narrowest point of the ravine, a stone bottleneck no wider than a doorway. Elias went first, then Jonah, then Samuel. But behind Samuel the fog thickened into a wall, a shifting mass of pale tendrils. He turned. A silhouette stood inside it, tall, unmoving, watching. Then it stepped forward, and Samuel heard his own voice whisper back at him, "Come." Elias shouted from ahead, "Samuel, move!" But Samuel was frozen. The creature tilted its head, perfectly mirroring the way Samuel himself tilted his head when tracking deer. Jonah lunged and grabbed Samuel's arm. For a moment the fog fought him, pulling Samuel backward with the strength of unseen hands. Jonah roared, yanked with all his might, and Samuel tore free. The men broke through the ravine's end and stumbled into open snow. Only 3 remained. The forest behind them fell silent, dead silent, as if the creatures had chosen not to follow, or had already taken what they needed. Hours later, Elias, Jonah, and Samuel staggered into the distant outpost, frostbitten, delirious, half-conscious. Samuel collapsed first. When they lifted him, something strange was found pressed against the wound on his cheek, a small piece of bark, with his own handwriting carved into it. Just one word, learn. No tracks led to his cot. No visitor had entered the room. No one saw who or what left it. Samuel never returned to the mountains. Elias never spoke of what he saw. And Jonah Pike disappeared 2 winters later in a forest hundreds of miles away, his cabin door found open, footprints leading into the trees, and barefoot human prints leading out. The survivors escape, but the forest does not forget them, nor do the creatures stop learning. History remembers Black Hollow not as a tragedy of men, but as a riddle of the wilderness, a case relegated to footnotes, half-lost reports, and oral accounts whispered across generations of lumber camps. Yet when we return to the surviving documents, a picture forms. Not a complete picture, not one we can claim with certainty, but something like an outline traced in frost, a shape watching from the woods, a presence learning from those who fear it, a mystery that refuses to settle into a single explanation. The U.S. Forest Service record from 1880 lists Black Hollow under a single line item: camp abandoned due to hostile wildlife activity. 3 missing. Investigation inconclusive. No mention of the creatures. No mention of mimicry. No mention of what the survivors claimed. But in a margin note left in pencil, in handwriting unlike any clerk's formal script, an investigator added, "Tracks inconsistent with known fauna. Human-like impressions alternating patterns. Forest unnaturally quiet." The note is unsigned, perhaps intentionally. Local newspapers at the time printed brief, sober warnings. December 14th, 1879. Bitterroot Bulletin. Foreman Elias Turner and 2 companions reached the southern outpost in dire condition, the report being followed by an unknown presence. Further inquiry is recommended before any logging resumes, but further inquiry never came. Within weeks, a winter storm sealed the valley under drifts taller than horses. By spring, Black Hollow was little more than a half-collapsed ring of cabins, its palisade half buried, its cookhouse roof cracked under snow, and whatever signs remained had been erased by the forest. Decades later, oral accounts preserved by regional historians shed additional light. Elias Turner, deposition, 1893. Aged, gaunt, and rigid in manner, Elias described the mimicry with a soldier's precision. It watched how we worked, how we walked, how we breathed. It did not stalk us like prey. It studied us like a trade. He refused to describe the creature's face. When pressed, he said only, it did not know what a face should be. And that was the worst of it. Samuel Reed, journal entry, 1887. Samuel left the frontier entirely. He became a quiet farmhand near Missoula, married late in life, had no children, and rarely spoke of the mountains. But one journal entry survives. Some nights when the wind shifts, I hear my own voice outside the door. Not calling, practicing. Samuel never returned to the forests. The disappearance of Jonah Pike, 1881. Jonah moved south after the Black Hollow incident, claiming he wanted quiet country. He settled near a small river settlement, but vanished one winter without signs of struggle. Searchers found his boots neatly placed by his cabin door. Bare footprints, human in size, wrong in pattern, led into the timberline. Beside them, a second set of prints that began on all fours rose to 2 legs for 3 steps, and then dropped to the ground again. No body was ever found. Among lumber camps in Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas, a new form of campfire caution emerged in the 1880s. Children were warned, if you hear your own voice in the woods, you walk the other way. New loggers were told, a thing that stands only when watched is not a thing you want to see. And old woodsmen whispered another rule, never teach the forest your name. These sayings traveled far beyond the Bitterroot Mountains. Some versions attributed them to mischief spirits. Others blamed mountain wraiths or feral mimic men. But one name became most enduring, found in the notebooks of trapped fur traders, carved into the backs of cabins and etched into the long memory of the frontier. Descriptions vary, but a consistent thread binds them. A creature that learns, not merely copying sound, not merely imitating shape, but slowly assembling the idea of a human being, piece by piece, gesture by gesture, voice by voice. A thing that begins as shadow, then silhouette, then posture, and finally becomes something almost, but never fully, like the men who saw it. Camp legends claim it grows more accurate each time it witnesses a new face, that it shows curiosity before hunger, that it does not consume bodies, it absorbs mannerisms, borrowing the details, improving the imitation. Stories tell of multiple beings, sometimes appearing in pairs, sometimes more, always near ravines, abandoned camps, or places where men behave predictably. One lumber cook in 1895 wrote, "It learns fastest from fear. The moment you break and run, it takes that shape too." Another account, "It does not kill to feed. It kills to study." In the early 1900s, an amateur folklorist named Ruth Agnes Kellner traveled through Idaho collecting frontier myths. She encountered an elderly trapper who claimed to have seen the imitators once in his youth. He warned her, if it ever learns to speak in full, it won't need to hide anymore. Kellner published her notes, which were dismissed as superstition. But her private diary, discovered only after her death, reveals a different detail. While camping on the Bitterroot's southern ridge, she wrote, heard two sets of footsteps outside the tent, one heavy, one light. The lighter walked in pairs, left, right, as if practicing. She cut her expedition short the next morning. In her final entry, she added, "The forest is remembering something. I do not wish to be included. Today, Black Hollow remains officially unmarked. No trail signs lead to it. Most maps omit the clearing entirely. A few locals insist the wilderness reclaimed it too quickly, as if the valley preferred forgetting. Yet hikers have reported strange noises in winter, the echo of hammering in empty woods, the sound of two people walking out of step, a voice calling their name from deeper inside the pines. In 1974, a ranger monitoring a fire line captured an audio file of rhythmic tapping. Not quite woodpecker, not quite human. The pattern repeats something eerily similar to a 19th century lumber command. Experts called it coincidence. Others weren't so sure. 3 cabins from the original camp still stand, barely their beams softened by a century of rot and snow. The palisade is gone. The saw pit is collapsed. The bunkhouse doorway is tilted, half swallowed by earth. Visitors say the place feels wrong. Not haunted, not violent, just observed, as if someone or something watches from between the trees, trying to decide how it should stand. Some hikers claim they've seen a figure lean from behind a pine, perfectly still, head slightly tilted in a familiar, deeply human gesture. Others swear they saw footprints in the frost appear in pairs, 2 human prints. A hesitation, then 4, then 2 again, as if whatever left them had not settled on how many limbs it preferred. No one stays long, no one stays after dark. Some say Black Hollow is empty now. Others say it is full of every voice the forest ever learned. And if you walk there long enough, you may hear your own among them. If you enjoyed this historical encounter, subscribe for more stories from the past, where forgotten trails, old journals, and the darker corners of folklore still hold secrets waiting to be uncovered.